In your experiences, what do you think are some of the top things people can do and organizations can do to combat the supply chain risk issue? Are solutions like zero trust and implementing those types of philosophies into environments some best ways to do that?
Yeah. And, Dan, of course, I think we all learned a lot from the SolarWinds incident.
Yeah.
Uh, and I do want to mention that, certainly none of the major banks that I've worked with had were exposed to that, fortunately. Um, but I think it was a wake up call for a lot of folks who, frankly, had not been exposed to that kind of scenario. But at the same time, it was not a surprise to a lot of other folks, especially security professionals, have been seeing how just the sophistication of cyber attacks have evolved, even just in the past 5 to 7 years. So it's not surprising that we saw something like SolarWinds, where not only was the development platform for developing the SolarWinds tools was compromised without being detected, but then that compromised software being distributed out to organizations where once those applications were triggered, we're able to do things again going undetected. If I recall correctly, it was Mandiant who actually was using the tool. And because of their sophisticated monitoring activities, even they had challenges in terms of detecting that outbound link coming from that malware. But yeah, just that once again, it showed how challenging it can be to detect, compromised software, especially if it's coming from a reputable vendor. And then, of course, there's a whole interesting discussion out there in terms of reliance on open source and open source code, in
Yeah.
terms of where you get it, how effective are the tools out there to be able to use what we call static and dynamic code analysis to look for things like, backdoors that may have been inserted into open source code. Dan, let me say this. I mean, at the Federal Reserve, we're not prescriptive in terms of what controls banks should use. And that's very intentional because first of all, each and every bank and their environment, what they do is unique. So, if you make a recommendation for a particular technology control, that may not necessarily be best for another bank. There is a lot of diversity in terms of how banks historically have set up their systems, their network environments, and things like that. And also because, frankly, the Federal Reserve, we don't want to basically suppress any innovative ideas out there. We've seen the banks come up with, I think, some really, personally, I think, brilliant solutions to address risk. So when it comes to supply chain attacks, I would just suggest that what's most important is what the Federal Reserve typically focuses on in our discussions with banks, and that's really just understanding the risk, identifying the risk scenarios that would be pertinent to their particular organization, looking at whether the current state of their control and control capabilities can address these kind of scenarios, especially when we see a major incident like SolarWinds. It's always a learning opportunity when that happens. And then if there's one thing I do personally emphasize when I talk to banks, it's the importance of testing, to test against these types of scenarios. So I'm talking about a variety of different types of tests. There's the testing, of course, in terms of the tests that you want to actually have in your control processes. So like with supply chain attack, make sure that you're doing testing, effectively of any kind of source code that's being developed or certainly brought in from the outside. And then, of course, testing against the actual scenario in terms of, say, a threat actor getting a foothold in the environment. So some of the questions I typically ask banks are, have you recently tested, for example, the scenario where a piece of compromised software does get in and it starts scanning the internal network to do discovery, and maybe we start seeing some lateral movement by the threat actor? Have you tested for that scenario to see if your sensors can actually detect, that lateral movement and things like that?